I work with Clementine Twin Lakes. It's a residential facility for teenage girls, biologically female, from the ages of 11 to 17. So we get a lot of kiddos that are pretty young. We're one of the organizations, or one of the states with the organization that takes kids as young as we do. There are Clementines nationwide. I think there are 6, 7 and growing. We just opened one in Chicago. But our census happens to skew relatively young, which means we're seeing this happen earlier and earlier. And I'm hoping that what's happening is that people are getting hip to it earlier rather than the actual manifestation of this happening earlier. But it could be a little bit of both, given some of the things that we're going to talk about as influencers and how this can manifest and how it can come up. But if this is something that you're new to, this is going to be a good overview. If this is something you have kind of an inkling about, I think this has got enough information to keep you interested. I hope so. Please do pepper in questions as you have them. I'm happy to answer them as I can. And if there's any kind of themes or threads in the conversation that you want me to focus on at the end, I'm happy to do that as well. So in the interest of time, we can go ahead and get started unless anybody has any questions out of the gates. All right, let's see if I can get this guy going. All right. All right, can you guys see what I'm sharing?
Yep, we got it.
Awesome. Right, so understanding eating disorders 101. So the things that we're going to cover are kind of the key points, at least, are going to be an overview of eating disorders, the influential factors of like the development of them, the family, psychological, and cultural influences. How do we assess it? How do we treat it? And what's available out there to our families and support system? At the very least, eating disorders do not happen in a vacuum. They are influenced by a variety of things in both their development and in the recovery process. So we're going to get into all of those different things as we proceed. So basic facts, we see a lot of them in Western civilizations. However, one of the big myths in eating disorders is this is a rich white girl's disease, and that's just not true. This actually is something that happens across a variety of different cultural, socioeconomic, and demographic settings. It also happens across men and women. So we're looking at the incidence of eating disorders actually rising among teens and children. I think that's for a variety of reasons. Social media certainly plays a part in that, the increased pressure on how we look, and also I think just the saturation of information and media about what it takes to fit in and to be loved and accepted, I think are all things that contribute to it. Women are more likely to struggle with this than men. That's not to say that men don't have it. We are seeing a rise actually in men at the moment, but historically and still present day, we're looking at a predominantly female affliction, if you will, or disorder. So this is something that can span across any age, but we are tending to see it happening earlier and earlier with young women, which is why early intervention is so important and why events like this are something that warmed my heart, just so that parents are aware of kind of how to help their little ones as they go through the puberty process and through high school and just all the stresses that go along with it. So the myths, only rich white girls develop eating disorders, just not true. We get a variety of different demographic groups that actually struggle with this. Only young women, again, not true. You can have it across any number of age span. I've seen kids as young as 7, and I've had clients as old as 67. So it's something that can very much perpetuate across different ages, different groups. It is not a cry for attention. I think it can be really hard for someone who doesn't understand or work in mental health or in the industry of eating disorders specifically to understand that it is not just as simple as, which is hard because that feels in some ways like something that should be intuitive. But it's so much more than that. It's a constellation of things, and to minimize it as like, oh, this is just a cry for attention. Even if it starts that way, unfortunately, the way that the malnourished brain works is that we can get really rigid really fast. And so even if you feel like it is a cry for attention, keep an eye on it, because it can escalate and it can turn ugly really quickly. If you're not significantly underweight, you're okay. That's actually not true. People who struggle with binge eating or bulimia could be at a normal weight or maybe even overweight based on where their body is supposed to be and actually be malnourished. So I think we have this classic kind of definition of what anorexia looks like and what an eating disorder looks like. And it doesn't necessarily fit the mold. So you're not looking for just signs of weight loss or being radically underweight. There are a variety of different psychological and behavioral things that you might notice. Disorders are not a choice. Same with any mental illness. It's not necessarily a choice. The action of recovery is a choice. But a lot of things can feed into the development of an eating disorder, and oftentimes it is not a choice, and oftentimes that can be very, very overwhelming for somebody to struggle with it, because what they think is, I've done this to myself. And we try to destigmatize that while also empowering of like, no, this is where we're at, and also recovery is a choice you can make, and there are things that we can do to resource around that process. The eating disorders, so you've got anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, and then the other specified and unspecified eating disorders. Sorry for the spacing on that, that looks a little bit wonky, but the three that we think about most often, and oftentimes the ones that we see at my level of care, which is residential, anorexia and bulimia. We do also serve the binge eating population, but we just don't see as much of that. Most of that is insurance driven, because binge eating disorder is actually one of the eating disorders that's actually most common and most prevalent. And also we are under a more medical model, and so the insurance companies are more inclined to pay for the secondary effects of binge eating, meaning high cholesterol, diabetes, and other physiological manifestations than they are the root cause of why are we binge eating in the first place. Bulimia we'll see a lot, and then anorexia we see as our prevalent diagnosis in residential and in most treatment centers. One, because it's in some ways the easiest to spot once you know what you're working against. So this different presentation of what we just talked about. So prevalence is a really big thing. So these numbers are the most recent ones I've been able to kind of get my hands on. I would be surprised if it's not increasing in this past year with COVID and everything going on. We are noticing that we are getting a significant higher admissions rate, wait list rate, and the acuity of kids specifically is far increased than it was this time last year. So I have a feeling and a suspicion, just anecdotally, that this information is a little bit dated, given the events of 2020. We're seeing just a lot more kiddos struggling and a lot more adults struggling to kind of keep up with the pressures of balancing everything in a now virtual world that happened in some ways overnight. So statistics of people suffering with orthorexia and diabulimia, we don't have a whole lot of information on those two diagnoses. We'll get into what those two mean in just a second. But overall, you're looking at pretty high prevalence for mental illness, and eating disorders, or people who struggle with eating disorders often have co-occurring diagnoses. It very rarely happens in a vacuum. Normative discontent. I think almost every woman that you've ever met can relate to going into her closet in the fall and having a pair of jeans that does not fit, and not feeling like all of a sudden there is a value label on I'm not good, or I've done it wrong, or I've let myself go. It's actually normal for women to feel discontent about their bodies, and that's something that is important to highlight, because mothers who raise daughters who might be telling their daughter they're beautiful, but then looking in the mirror and saying something about themselves that's negative, can send conflicting messages, and that can perpetuate the disorder itself. Our culture itself doesn't allow women or men to feel okay about like deviation from that idealized version. And it's actually not typical for someone to feel good about their weight or size or shape. And that's just because we have been historically in a very ideal environment. I think that is changing. I think there's more information around body positivity and help that every size is becoming more prevalent, but there are some remnants, if you will, of what bodies look like and what they should look like historically, and how that impacts our social media, how that impacts our self-worth, and how that impacts our kids. So just being aware of those things. Eating disorders can be correlated and are correlated with really high death rates, and this can be for any number of reasons. Eating disorders can impact any body system that cancer can. So it's not just about the weight. This is about a systemic thing that impacts literally every body system. So everything from your hair, skin, and nails to your reproductive organs to acute kidney failure or impacting your liver. Like, this is a pretty serious thing. For purgers or people who struggle with purging, Cardiac arrest is actually incredibly common because of the strain that purging consistently puts on the heart. And also suicide. The malnourished brain or the tormented brain is not necessarily one that makes or is able to make choices to stay alive sometimes, for lack of better language. I know that this is kind of a heavy topic for a Tuesday night, but suicide is common and does happen with people who struggle with eating disorders. 5 to 20% of individuals who struggle with anorexia will die prematurely. Unfortunately, one of my sister programs in Pennsylvania just had a client die. She was 47 and she died in her sleep. So this is something that is very real, and it's something that when I think about what we do and the age that we treat, I'm really grateful that the industry has come this far in it, because getting help early and often means that this doesn't have to be a death toll. And in fact, we can help resource around and cope around and figure out what function the eating disorder is serving earlier than historically was viable, because just it wasn't talked about. Causes, there is not a singular cause. There's any number of things that influence this. Genetics can be a part, family dynamics, dieting gone wrong, so meaning like you might have 10 teenage girls who are like, we're going to go on a diet, and only one of them develops an eating disorder. So it's not necessarily that everybody who goes on a diet is going to develop an eating disorder, but almost no one who has an eating disorder has never been on a diet. So it's just kind of one of those things we're looking at it. Trauma is incredibly common in eating disorder presentation. That can be sexual trauma, it can be emotional trauma, it can be any number of things that they're just not equipped to manage or navigate. And the eating disorder becomes a really clear way to define success. Anorexia, this is the one that people are probably most familiar with. So this is restriction of energy intake relative requirements. What does that mean? It means I'm not eating enough to balance out what I'm expending. So you could be eating a 2,000 calorie daily meal plan, and if you're at the gym for 8 hours, that's not enough. You're not meeting your intake needs. Or I could have a kiddo who is like, I don't eat more than 300 calories a day, and if I do, then I'm a failure. And so it really can run the gamut, but really what we're looking at is energy intake versus energy expenditure. Paired with anorexia is the intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat. A lot of distortion in how they view their body. So you could be looking at someone who is objectively thin, and what they experience in their body is that I am, morbidly obese and that I can't fit through a doorway, and that is not hyperbolic. That's truly how they see themselves. And also a minimization of the issue. So you can have a kiddo who is literally struggling, and you're watching her and you're melting down, and they're like, it's fine, I'm fine. Or their grades might be top notch, because clients who struggle with eating disorders tend to be very smart, and they know how to outwit the system, and they are good at keeping the peace and being mediators. They're also crippling perfectionists oftentimes. And so they're really good at minimizing or hiding it. And so that's where grades are not an indication of your child's mental health. It's a bigger picture than that. And so just being aware of everything that's going on for your kiddo. There are subtypes. So anorexia is often thought of just food intake restriction. But honestly, it can be a restriction, which is the classic, like, I don't eat anything. And there can be the binge purge type. The binges could be subjective. So 2 Oreos could feel like a binge, or I've gone overboard, or a cup of oatmeal. Again, if you're restricting down to 300 calories a day and you allow yourself to have 400, that could be perceived as a binge. And the inability to tolerate that distress of going over what you've allowed yourself to have can be crippling, and it can be damning. And what will happen then is that they will purge or compensate in some way, shape, or form. Bulimia, that's defined by recurrent episodes of binge eating and recurrent episodes of inappropriate compensatory behaviors. What does that mean? That means I'm overeating, meaning I'm eating past hunger or fullness cues to an extent that then I feel guilt, shame, frustration, or I'm not adhering to the diet that I've set for myself. The cabbage diet, the keto diet, whatever the diet is, they operate in such a strict parameter of it that it's not sustainable. And so what happens is then overeating and not following their body cues, and then that feeling of, again, intense guilt, shame, I should have more self-control, I can't believe I did that. And so it's very much this diet cycle that can incite a significant amount of guilt, shame, and frustration. Purging type is self-induced vomiting, and then non-purging type is compensatory behaviors like excessive exercise, laxatives, diuretics, and don't underestimate what that can be. When we talk about compulsive exercise, that can be 4 to 10 miles in their room overnight while their family is sleeping. It can be very secretive. You might not know what's going on. You might see your kiddo eating, and then overnight they're basically exercising the entire night long with an incredible amount of shame and frustration and fixation and rigidity around it. It's not uncommon that we'll see kids with bruised spines from doing sit-ups. On the floor, on the hard floor, they'll come in with calluses on their hands from doing an excessive and extreme amount of push-ups. Burpees are common. Walking their rooms overnight, like they can do an inordinate amount of exercise while everybody else is sleeping and while you think they're sleeping. And so this is something that should be taken into consideration if you expect or if you have the notion that something's going on. It's always good to get curious about it because it can get really dangerous and really out of hand really quickly. And then binge eating disorder is the most common of all the disorders, but unfortunately we see it the least in residential treatment. Recurrent episodes of binge eating, and that's associated with eating a significant amount of food in a single setting and essentially numbing with food. So the same way that someone who struggles with alcoholism might struggle with drinking, someone who struggles with binge eating disorder, they don't know how to stop and their body's cues aren't built in the same way. It's not a self-control issue. It's actually an emotional thing that's going on that's cueing that excessive overeating and intense discomfort. So other presentations, orthorexia, we're seeing this more and more and more. And honestly, I'm seeing more and more kids who are developing anorexia who come from households where there is an orthorexic parent. So this means excessive focus on healthy foods. What does that mean? We only eat farm to table. We only eat organic. We only eat the rainbow. What happens when you're on a road trip and you got to make the McDonald's or the 7-Eleven work? And so orthorexia really doesn't allow for what happens when life happens. What happens when you have a birthday and somebody has cupcakes or there's pizza? If there's an intense rigidity around we only eat healthy versus kind of this it's balance, moderation, variety, and kind of moving through it, then we are seeing more and more presentation because it's internalized with the kids. The only thing I can eat. Compulsive exercises, really rigid rules about exercise to the point of interfering with the daily functioning. They can be very malnourished. And then there's ARFID. So that's avoidant restrictive feeding intake disorder. This is more than just picky eating. There's not a fear of weight gain. There's not a fear of being fat. Oftentimes it is more sensory than that and can be very anxiety driven because again, most eating disorders are functional in nature. And so eating like whether it's safe foods and whether it's things that we've identified as that I'm comfortable with or uncomfortable with can be a way to self-soothe. So the avoidant restrictive feeding intake disorder, you're going to see kiddos who only eat chicken nuggets, mac and cheese, and white rice. And that's it. And I'm not talking about for like a phase or a spell. I'm talking like this would create intense fear, agitation, frustration, and we try to diversify that palette. So ARFID is something that is also out there and is getting more and more information kind of learned about it. And honestly, one of the things that can be best for that is working with a registered dietitian, not a nutritionist, a registered dietitian who understands that, who can work through it with sensory or systematic desensitization. So that essentially means exposure after exposure after exposure in a way that is hierarchical in nature. So starting with something that is uncomfortable versus something that's terrifying. So just being mindful that that's also on the radar, and a lot of parents really don't know what they're looking at when they're looking at some intense anxiety around restrictive intake. Our diet cycle, again, this is something that is perpetuated in our society, in our households, and that is internalized by our kiddos. So our youth of America, the youth of tomorrow are really hearing this in a very real way. So the desire to be thin, well, why do I want to be thin? Well, because it's what's pretty, it's what's accepted, it's what I'm being told will get me farther in life. So I diet. So then I have cravings, which means I have reduced self-control, which then I lose control and I end up in mindless eating or overeating or just eating a normal amount with a substantial amount of guilt because it's not within that diet parameter, which can cause weight gain or, again, the emotional of just significant guilt, and then the cycle starts over. So even if somebody looks well on the outside, there might be a very ingrained pattern of feeling inadequate in this regard and feeling like their existence is kind of distilled down to, am I thin, am I not, how do I look, how do I not? And it's not about vanity, it's really about, am I going to be accepted, am I going to be loved, am I going to be cared for? And the vulnerability that's inherently there in all of those things. So like, this is not a vanity thing, this is not about food, weight, or shape, this is about core beliefs of rejection and acceptance. The biopsychosocial model, so we've got a couple things. I don't love the analogy, but it is the genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. That's really what we're up against. So if we've got genetic vulnerabilities, so that can be a genetic predisposition to anxiety, to the eating disorder, to OCD, then our social and climactic influences. So basically kind of looking at, what's your friend group look like? Does, what does mom's friend group look like? What does dad's friend group look like? What does my society, my school, my peer group say is important? And so then we have this function of like this interplay of, one, am I vulnerable? And two, if I'm vulnerable, am I in the right environment to either cultivate a healthy relationship with food, weight, and shape, or one that was going to be very disordered and dysfunctional? This is probably the most important slide for my families and for my teachers. So physical signs, we're going to spend a little bit of time here. Fluctuations in weight up and down. Wearing baggier clothes can be a really big one. Honestly, the uniform at my residential location is baggy shirts and leggings. I think in some ways it's a little hard to tell if that's a marker right now because we're in COVID, so nobody's going anywhere. So just being aware that like there might be some of these that might not be tried and true in our new environment because they just don't have the same opportunity. Systemic cramps, I can't tell you how many kiddos come through my doors where it's like, we thought we were dealing with a GI thing. We went to XYZ specialist, and it takes a while. But it doesn't take a while because eating disorders aren't easy to diagnose. It takes a while because eating disorders are inherently sneaky. And the kids who struggle with them and the individuals who struggle with them happen to be very, very bright. And it's also a very solid coping skill. And so what happens is, this is a coping skill. They don't want to give it up because it's functional. It helps them feel safe. It helps them feel included. It helps them feel like they can triangulate a very complex world into something that is more simple, more straightforward, and more kind of success-oriented. So menstrual irregularities, that's going to happen with almost all of our little girls. Difficulties concentrating, dizziness, especially upon standing. So that's as a result of your heart rate variability, like jumping pretty significantly between lying and standing. So they'll do what I refer to as couch surfing. So they'll stand up and kind of grab onto something. That dizziness, the fainting, so you can see them actually kind of black out for a minute. Feeling cold all the time, cuts and calluses across their top finger joint. So if they are engaging in purging behavior consistently, sometimes that can be a telltale sign. Dental problems, again with the purging, dry hair, dry skin, brittle nails, all of those things are indicators of poorly nourished bodies. Swelling around the cheeks and salivary glands, this is specific to the purging individuals or the ones who struggle with purging. It's really, your body gets so producing extra saliva because you are purging that when you stop purging, your body doesn't know what to do with that excess. And so it's incredibly painful because it's not getting used. And so those glands get very inflamed. And so honestly, that's one of the parts of the recovery process that's probably the most uncomfortable and that we try to normalize with our kiddos who have struggled with the purging history. Fine hair on their body. So you'll see kids kind of covered in this really fine, usually pretty dark, hair. It'll be in places where you don't typically have that much hair, so like across their backs. Their arms and legs could be hairier than normal, or than what would be normal for them, kind of given what age they are and how malnourished they might be. This is the body's way of trying to keep them warm and insulated because they don't have the same stores and reserves to be able to insulate and regulate their temperature appropriately. Increased preoccupation with weight, size, body image, preoccupation with weight, food, and calories. So you might notice they start calorie counting. There's any number of, My Plate versus MyFitnessPal versus, any number of calorie counting apps the kiddos can use. A lot of times they're on their smartphones or they're on their Apple Watches or, I've come in with kids I've had kids come in that are as young as 12 who are tracking their calorie and their intake without any real concept of what that means and what that means for their body, their health, their wellness, their ability to puberty. But you'll see this very intense fixation on it. You'll see rigidity when it comes to eating at the table, whether that's starting to cut out carbs and then cutting out meats and then cutting out desserts and then cutting out, like, it just is more and more and more restrictive. And so a lot of times families don't notice early because, again, it's like, oh, we're just being more health conscious. But in reality, it could be the early signs of an eating disorder. And so it's not to say that anytime that happens, you have to raise the alarm bells, but it is just getting curious of, like, what's going on there? Why are we, I'm noticing that you used to love the bread rolls. Why aren't we eating those anymore? Or you used to love having, this snack with your friends, and you haven't had that in a while. Or I'm noticing there's a lot in the pantry. What's going on there? Or I'm noticing this is disappearing a lot, and you seem really kind of not yourself lately. What's going on? So observation with curiosity can be your best friend with that. And honestly, that's with any kiddo that's struggling with anything, without judging it or going, why are you doing this? What's going on? It's, I'm noticing this. What's happening there? As opposed to what can feel more like blaming or frustration and anger. Food rituals, we see this a lot. I can only eat between certain hours. I'm cutting things into really small bites. I have to eat it in order of the scariest to the least scary, or vice versa. Pushing food around the plate, taking an abnormally long amount of time to eat, or eating incredibly quickly, which can mean I'm trying to avoid the food altogether, but I know I have to do this because somebody's watching me. So, like, food rituals, just, again, know your kid, notice what's going on for them, and bring it to their attention. And if you have concerns, bring it to somebody else's attention, meaning a professional. So a lot of times we'll see this, like, well, they used to eat every family supper, and then they just started to become more and more and more isolatory. So they don't eat with us anymore. Spending extended periods of time in the bathroom, that can be really dangerous and is really not only underreported, but also misunderstood by our families. So excessive periods in the bathroom can mean a couple things. It can mean you're drinking the shower water before weights, or they are purging in the restroom, or they're exercising in the restroom, or they're spending an inordinate amount of time body checking, which means, does my stomach look different today than it did earlier this morning? Or, have I gained 10 pounds because I ate breakfast? Or grabbing at different parts of their body to see if they can manipulate it in the same way, or bones are showing. So all of these things are things that I really want my parents to feel equipped to kind of know and be able to recognize. And again, you're not looking for data points, you are themes. So if one or two of these things are kind of cropping up, be curious about it. If you're seeing multiple in each list, it's time to reach out to somebody. So again, it's themes across a week, across 2 weeks, just to kind of see what's going on for your kiddo, because that could be just disordered eating, it could be stress, it could be an eating disorder. So just being really mindful of that. Understanding that this is, it is a mental illness, and I think a lot of times we lose sight of that because we get really lost in the severity of it and also in the banality of it, because again, eating feels very, very simple. But if we are asking someone who struggles to complete a meal that they identify as unsafe or unhealthy, what we're really doing is asking them to write with their non-dominant hand while we are screaming obscenities in their ears. So, like, it is not as straightforward as take a bite. It is far more substantial than this. It is far bigger than this. And so I think sometimes we can get paralyzed by our fear or by our own misunderstanding. And so just being aware that they are more than an eating disorder. Your kid is still your kid, your loved one is still your loved one, but also being very aware of the fact that the eating disorder can make your loved one present and act in a way that is not congruent with who they have historically been. Kids who have been historically guilt-ridden, if they were to lie or misbehave, will steal food or lie to your face about what they did or didn't eat. They'll become very manipulative, and they'll underreport. And because your kid has always been, this responsible, perfectionistic, driven individual, you want to believe them. And unfortunately, if there is an active eating disorder happening, their reality is very different than reality itself. And so it's just being very, very aware of that, and truth without judgment is a really important thing. So it is what it is, and trying not to judge and getting the help and support that they need along the way is really important. If you suspect an eating disorder, what do? We ask that you ask questions, get help. I will say from a professional standpoint, there is a large and significant difference between a nutritionist and a registered dietitian. A nutritionist doesn't necessarily have to have the same credentialing. A registered dietitian is going to at least have more exposure to the eating disorder. And honestly, if you suspect an eating disorder, it's best to get an eating disorder dietitian. Because inadvertently what can happen is they can encourage the clients to do things that might be actually detrimental to the eating disorder itself, like counting calories. Like, you just need to eat X number of calories a day. And it's like, well, if they're already counting, or if they weren't counting before, now they are. So just being really mindful of the type of professional help that you get. This isn't, we go to the gym and we talk to the guy that's, seems to have it figured out. This is we need to figure out a professional to help our kiddo, because they are two very different things. And that's not to say nutritionists can't be well informed, because some of them very much are, but more often than not, you're going to get someone who has sound professional in that regard, if they are a registered dietitian. It is not a phase. Please do not minimize it, because they're already doing that enough. So just being aware that like something is going on, whether it's a full-blown eating disorder, or whether it's crippling anxiety, or whether it's just situational sadness in a transitional period of, like, I don't know, COVID, or transitioning to schools from in-person to online, or any number of things that we're kind of up against on a day-to-day basis. Being really mindful that not treating it like a phase, because sometimes they are screaming in a whisper, waiting for somebody to notice, and pissed when somebody does notice, because again, this is a functional coping skill. A lot of people don't realize how functional it is. We are backfilling for any number of things, whether it's fear of rejection, the desire for love and acceptance. Very real emotions are behind this relationship with food, weight, and shape. Looking at your own relationship with food can be incredibly helpful. Especially for my parents with kiddos in the home that are still learning kind of what their bodies need. What foods are available? Is this a we never have junk food and soda house, or is this dieting, like, are you on the next diet every other day? How do we talk about it? Are we talking about it of like what my body needs today, or wouldn't it be nice to get outside, versus I have to run 5 miles today, or else, whatever that means, right? So just being mindful of, especially with the little ones, like being mindful of how we talk about food, weight, and shape within our house and our own bodies. Saying, I'd like to get out and get active today. I'd like to get out and move my body today is very, very different than we have to go to the gym for an hour. You have to go run laps around the whatever, or I can't eat that, or I really need to watch that. I can't have that. That's bad. Because what happens is we internalize what we eat. I don't think we realize how often we do it, but food is love, food is community, but food is also something that's easy to internalize. So if I identify something as good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, right or wrong, then if I eat that, then I am all of those things, right? So if I identify fat as bad and I eat fat, then by proxy, I am bad. And so that is how quickly an eating disorder can develop. So just being really mindful with your language, because what's happening, unfortunately, in some of the school systems and some of the health and PE classes, they're getting some misinformation about fats and sugars and all of these things. And the reality of it is all foods fit. No one should be eating pizza for every meal, just like no one should be eating apples for every meal. And so we're looking at balance and moderation and variety. And honestly, out of those two things, balance and variety more than anything else. And just being aware and cognizant of your own relationship with your food, weight, and shape, and knowing how that's going to trickle down to your kiddos is really important. We have a couple different levels of care. So each is intended to address a very specific kind of set of treatment goals. So inpatient hospitalization, this is in the hospital. They're oftentimes on an NG tube, meaning a nasogastric tube. So it goes in through their nose down to their stomach, and they are getting tube-fed Ensure or Boost or high-calorie nutrition drinks overnight, and potentially during the day, depending on if they are able to consume food orally or not. Sometimes the level of rigidity or fear will impact their ability to do that. Other times they'll be able to complete some, but not all of what their body needs. This is the level that they get to when their vitals get really scary. So if we're seeing a significant variance in heart rate, or if we're seeing that they're significantly dehydrated, or if their liver enzymes are such that it becomes a concern, that's where you go to the hospital, and that is truly just for medical stabilization. There's not a whole lot of therapy that happens. You might have a psychiatrist that does rounds, you're going to have a medical doctor that does rounds, and then by and large, it's just watching and waiting for those things to stabilize. Residential treatment, that's me, that's us at Clementine. There are a couple other facilities in the area as well. It's 24/7. We have 24/7 nursing. You're going to have therapeutic groups throughout the course of every day. You're going to have individual sessions with your individual therapist. You're going to have family therapy. You're going to have a session with your registered dietitian, and then all of the groups. And honestly, the groups are the gold of eating disorder treatment, because it can be such an isolating disease that what we want is for them to be able to hotwire connection over something that they can understand, and also pull each other up through the times of recovery because they understand it. And one of the things we work with on the kids of like, listen, you're going to have people who understand you, people who support you, and people who love you in this process, and they might not always be the same people. So the people who understand you might be your peers in treatment. The people who love you might be your family, and the people who support you might be your family and your treatment team. And maybe we're not the right people to understand you, but maybe your peers aren't the right people to support you in the recovery process because they are also struggling. And so helping them to delineate, like being angry at parents for not understanding, maybe they're not supposed to understand. That doesn't mean they can't love and support you. Partial hospitalization is also known as PHP. That is anywhere from 5 to 12 hours a day, 5 to 7 days a week. So you're looking at pretty intense support. They're coming home at night, usually having supper and night snack with their family. That is the level of care where they start to reintegrate into or start to ramp up care towards the residential or towards intensive outpatients. They're getting to be in their home, they're getting to be in their environment, but they're still getting a pretty ample amount of support throughout the course of the day with groups and with meals. And then intensive outpatient is anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a night, or 3 to 5 nights a week. And so that's in some ways the last group-oriented stage in the level of care process. And so you're doing usually at least one supported meal in addition to a couple groups, and then we would also encourage individual sessions with a dietitian or with your individual therapist. And then outpatient therapy, that's something that can happen as the gateway in or the kind of last days out. And that can be something that happens bi-weekly, weekly, once a month. It really just depends on where the individual is at in the recovery process. But really that's the maintenance mode of like, hey, we're spot checking, we're seeing how things are going, we're looking at transition stressors, and we're ramping up supports and resources as needed based on what's going on. But really that's where they should be out and about living kind of their best life, being able to tolerate a normal amount of distress, being able to adequately nourish their bodies, and being able to articulate their needs in a productive way, not using their body as a mechanism to communicate. Chronic malnutrition is a medical emergency. I have a lot of parents that don't realize how bad it is until they're in the hospital. Like, I had no idea, and that's normal. Like, I hate to say that, but honestly, what we're working on is restoring that physical and nutritional stability. We are looking at the things that are contributing to it, whether it's family systems, whether it's, just temperament and disposition. What's interesting is we're looking at the research, and the gray matter is such that someone with a really malnourished brain has a brain that's very comparable to somebody with dementia. So they're really not able to fire and wire in the same ways. And so it's like, just eat. It's like, it's not that simple. Or it's like, this isn't a big deal. It is. And until their bodies are nourished and until their brain gets into that recovery space where it is on a cellular level able to fire and wire appropriately, they're not able to make new connections. That thought process is going to remain rigid, fixed, versus someone who is in the recovery process or who has a appropriately nourished brain is going to be able to be more rational, to have more grounding, to ask for supports in a different way. The malnourished brain is a very, very scary thing. The good thing about this is the malnourished brain is something that is capable of healing. The myelin sheath is what covers our brain cells, and it's what actually allows for communication from one end to the other to be continuous across ends of it. And what happens is if we're malnourished, then that communication across that cell is choppy. So it's literally misfiring information, which is something I think is important to understand from a validation perspective of like, you're not crazy, but this is how your brain is working right now. I know this is hard because it is hard. And so just being able to offer some science backing to why their thought processes are what they are can be incredibly validating, because again, these kids are incredibly bright. Almost all of them are, in the AP classes and then some. They're very high driven, smart individuals. So having a grounding in science can be really comforting. Transitional influences, being aware of what environmental factors might be at play and contribute to it. There is a function to the eating disorder. Like I said, it could reduce anxiety, it could reduce fear, it could stabilize their mood. The eating disorder on some level is providing relief for something. If I know what that something is, which is where therapy can be really helpful, of identifying what's missing here, what are we bolstering, what are we backing, and what we can do is help them to figure out, how do I navigate a world without this coping skill that has been in some ways life-saving and transformational, even if it's counterproductive and not great for them. So recognizing that these stressors can increase it, but the eating disorder is very, very functional. And if we know how to resource around it, then we can work towards the recovery process together. I don't ever see just an eating disorder straightforward. I almost always see a kiddo who comes in with something else going on, whether it meets the full criteria for depression, anxiety, OCD or not. There's some temperamental things or some potential chemical things that are also going on. And another piece that's really important when we talk about trauma and what else influences it, it doesn't always have to be the big T traumas. Big T traumas are things that people bring over casseroles for, right? Like a death in the family, a divorce, a natural disaster, right? These are big T traumas that everyone kind of objectively would say, that's really terrible, I'm really sorry, let's latch around this as a community, right? Small T traumas are little things like, I was feeling insecure in my relationship and my friend made eye contact with me in the hallway and then looked away and walked away. And then it left me questioning, our friendship. And then I got a 95 on a test I should have gotten 100 on. And then I went to practice or I went to try out for the team and I didn't quite make it, or I got feedback that I needed to do improvement. These are little things that can build, and if they're not processed effectively in the moment, they can build and have a cumulative effect of a big trauma. And so just being aware of the fact that right now kids are experiencing a lot of different stimuli. And so it's just important to kind of know and help them process on a day-to-day basis so that they're not getting saturated with these little stressors that in and of themselves aren't huge deals, but they can be collectively a big deal. Treating eating disorders is not for the faint of heart. Honestly, it's not. This can be incredibly difficult work. I mean, again, we're dealing with clients who are incredibly bright, family systems who overall are pretty well and high functioning. These kiddos are just trying to communicate something in a way that is not conducive for them and it's not sustainable. So you need to know what you're up against. I think any therapist is better than no therapist, but getting a therapist who understands the nuances of it, because there can be any number of things that don't feel connected to an eating disorder unless you know what you're looking at. Folding a blanket 20 times might look like OCD. I see overexercising, and it's just, what does that compensatory movement mean? Leaving just a smear of something behind doesn't feel like nutritionally a big deal, but it can be a hall pass celebration for the eating disorder. And so just having professionals who are clinically informed on what behaviors to look out for can, one, help you to be aware of it before it starts, or to get early intervention if you're noticing those things out of the gates. This is something we see a lot. My families really struggle with it at first because it takes these really docile, rule-abiding kids and it makes them angry and irritable, and they feel very out of control more often than not. And so our families will end up walking on eggshells in order to avoid confrontation, or they can become overly intense and overly forceful, meaning that this is the identified patient. We have to fix this eating disorder, and then everything else will go away and it'll be fine. It's like, that's not helpful either. Then we have the protective and nurturing. The one it's like I want to protect her from the consequences or the discomfort of the setting. And so we'll have parents sometimes go, I don't agree with that rule. And I'm like, I understand that, but unfortunately that's a natural consequence for engaging in it, because they don't want to make their child uncomfortable, which then can impact the recovery process and force those eating disorder behaviors. Like an example of that is a lot of kids will say, well, I should be able to have my phone because my friends are on there, and like, if you take my friends away, I'll just have no reason for anything. It's like, okay, well, you can have your phone or you can have social time if you're again completing your meals. If you're able to not purge after a meal, if you can go X number of hours without over-exercising. Because if you're engaging in your eating disorder, then you're not truly present for community anyhow. And so it can feel punitive out of the gates if you don't know what's kind of going on with it. It's actually something where it's like there are microaggressions from the eating that need to be nipped in order to reinforce a more pro-social and pro-intrapersonal kind of dynamic for that individual. There's a lot going on. Never expect something to happen quick or overnight, because oftentimes this has been bubbling for a while. Once it gets to the point of escalating, it can get really bad really quickly, but oftentimes this is something that's been going on for a long time. And our families just aren't aware of that, and that's of no fault to their own, because like I said, this is a very functional thing, and if your kiddo wanted you to know and was ready for you to know, you would have known. But they're not ready for it because they're very protective of it because it's functional. Recovery is not linear. Your best path through recovery is going through the levels of care based on what the treatment team is kind of seeing, not letting your kid influence it, because if you let a sick teenager drive treatment in any way, shape, or form, that's going to perpetuate that cycle and can inadvertently cause a lapse or a relapse. Complete recovery is possible. So I don't, as much as this is kind of a doomsday presentation of like, this is seriously, we need to take it serious. It is possible, and full recovery is absolutely something that Montanito believes so much is part of why I like working with them, is because there are a lot of folks within the organization who are in active recovery and have been in active recovery for years. And so that's always nice too. If one of my kids is really in a dark spot and it feels like it's appropriate to share, one of my staff members who has been through it might say something to the effect of, I've been where you are, and living without this is possible. And so I think that it's really important to remember that as well. Just again, being aware of this, of like how much emphasis we put on other people's appearance or size. Talking negatively about yourself or somebody else for how they look, or being overly fixated on how good somebody looks. Again, that relationship with food is like, is it good? Is it bad? It's like all food is nutritious to an extent. And again, we're looking for variety. Making fun or criticizing your own or somebody else's eating, you're like, oh, I just couldn't stay away from it. It says that it's drawing attention to something that might not need attention drawn to it. And again, none of these is the end of the world, because I think we're all kind of guilty of it. But it is just being really mindful of how we interact with food and our relationship with it. Again, self-awareness is the key. Let's start there. And then educate yourself. Like, there are so many good resources out there right now. There's the National Eating Disorder Association. There's the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals. There's Binge Eating Association, Academy for Eating Disorder. There's any number. You Google eating disorder resources, and you're going to be flooded with a lot of different information. There are also a lot of really, really good books out there to help you if you feel like your kiddo or someone you love is struggling with this. And there are plenty of treatment centers that are available to help individuals who are struggling. So I think that's really important as well. And then additional resources, those are all right there, and I can give Susie a copy of those as well. I feel like I just flew through and talked at you guys a lot, so I am really sorry.
And it's really hard too when you can't see everyone. So
I can't see anybody, and I could not see if anybody was typing, so I'm really sorry.
Right. So that was so much great information. We so appreciate that. We want to give anyone a chance to ask a question. You can either type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or, I mean, we're a small group. You can just unmute your mic to ask a question if you would like. And so I will start us off while everyone else is kind of thinking, because I did have a couple of questions. One, I know that a lot of us are parents or teachers or counselors of kids who are kind of starting into puberty. Can you talk for just a moment about the change, not the changes in puberty, but what we would expect in terms of body image and things like that, and body changes in puberty that affects the eating disorder kind of.
That's such a good point. And I really need to include a slide on this because I think it's such a good point, and I don't think that PE teachers or health classes really focus on this, especially for little girls going through puberty. You kind of have to go out before you go up, right? Your body needs to have those fat reserves in order to get your reproductive system kind of going, to say that your body is healthy. And so you need to anticipate, like as kiddos go through puberty, that their bodies will change and normalize that change for little girls. Like I had a kiddo the other day. I was like, well, you were supposed to kind of look like a tomato for a little bit, and then eventually you're not going to look like a tomato. And she's like, no one ever told me that. I'm like, I know they didn't, but here we are. And so I think it's just understanding that your bodies will change, and knowing that our goal for the malnourished ones or the ones who are struggling and need to gain weight is not to put on an inordinate amount of weight. What we're doing is we're following their growth curve. So everybody here who has kids has been to the pediatrician when they were little, and like every year they mark their growth, and they're doing it on height and they're doing it on weight, and you're getting a percentile. And so essentially what our registered dietitian is doing is looking at where does this individual need to be based on their body's curves. And that does change a little bit during puberty, but then it normalizes back out to whatever percentile they have historically been to. And so just remembering that even if a kiddo's body is changing, one, that's normal, and two, just keeping an eye on it. Honestly, I have a vendetta with a couple pediatricians that, I mean, they'll go, well, we need to look out for childhood obesity because it's become such a relation point. And then parents get scared, and then the kids have a reaction to it of like, yeah, my obese, is this bad? And it's like, no, you're going through something that is very normal, and your body's supposed to change, and it will even out.
Thank you. I have other questions that I can also ask, but anybody else want to ask anything or comment? Ms. Timmerman?
Hi. Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the information. I just wanted to know, you talk a little bit about mixed messages, like when you say your child is beautiful, and then you go in front of the mirror and, you know, criticize yourself in front of them. I tend not to do that, but at the same, definitely do not criticize them, but I am constantly trying to regulate their sugar intake. And I just want, like, do you have any tips on how to try to put that in their minds that it's not okay? Because I don't want to be the super strict mom, but I don't want them to have sugar every single day. And I guess we have so many holidays that surround that they surround themselves with candy, that is hard for me to figure out a way to say, no, enough is enough.
Well, and you might not need to. In all honesty, the more focus you put on it, the more it might be like, ooh, oh. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Hold on.
I can hear you.
Okay, so you might not need to actually draw attention to it. And in all honesty, most kids, even if you display a whole gambit of a buffet of things, and you've got the desserts on one end and the fruits on the other end, most kids are going to listen to their body. And the more we're like, oh, you don't need that, or that's enough, then sometimes that can internalize, this is a treat, this is only something if I'm doing right, and only something if I'm going to have a fun special, or it's that I can't have that at all. But honestly, just not drawing attention to it and providing them with a whole range of things, knowing that that will normalize, because kids are actually a lot better than adults at regulating their intake across and doing balance and variety naturally. And so what it feels like, I think a lot of times as parents, they need to kind of police things. And honestly, a lot of research is showing that the more options they have, the more likely they are to go for any number of options. You can always say, if you really feel like it's like, today we've had enough, like, why don't you, like, you can have a Kit Kat bar after you have an apple. let's try that. So it's like including or encouraging variety in that way, as opposed to enough is enough, you can't have that, or you can't eat if you're, you know, hungry. Instead, it's like offering alternatives and just knowing that kids tend to be a lot better at adults at regulating and providing that normalcy across and getting their nutrition needs met.
Thank you. Do you recommend in Ellen Satter, like any of her work with feeding? Do you know who that is? The division of responsibility with. Okay, I won't put anything about that then. Okay, Leanne.
So what are some strategies to, you know, kind of change the way the conversation goes with body image? I mean, I have boys, but they seem to fixate
I am so
on...
sorry, but I had technical difficulties. I missed the entire explanation. I really apologize.
Oh, so sorry.
I cannot hear you still. I'm not sure.
Oh, goodness. And
Lisa,
we will send this out as a recording afterwards.
Try to get out and come back in.
Okay.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Leanne.
Yeah, so I was just curious, like, I have boys and they seem very fixated with, you know, people's size and, you know, commenting on, you know, whether it's their own and they're not overweight or anything, or other people's, and kind of what's some tactful ways to sort of redirect that. You know, I always talk about everybody has a different shape and that's okay kind of thing, but I don't know what's creating the fixation on it necessarily, because I definitely don't talk about my body in front of them.
No, I think it's a good question, and honestly, it's something we're seeing more and more with younger guys being kind of honing in on it. I mean, honestly, I don't know if anybody else here is an X-Men fan, like Wolverine, like Hugh Jackman. Like in the initial movie, he was like built, and then in the next movie, he was like jacked, and then the next movie, it's like he's like this giant like beef of man. And so we're seeing more and more guys kind of err towards that, or view that as kind of the idealized masculine frame. But it sounds like you're redirecting in a helpful way, like, hey guys, like, what are we getting out of that? Like, why are we focusing on that? Is there enough about, like, what's going on there? And so it's just that observation with curiosity. And then also it's like, well, all bodies fit, and like there is health at every size. And so some people are supposed to be in larger bodies than others. You know, there are people from Thailand who are always going to be in small, slight frames, because that is what that group of people is supposed to be built like. The people from Sweden, not so much, right? And so like just being really aware of how different cultures and how different bodies are supposed to kind of be internalized, of like we're not all supposed to be the same, like, and just it sounds like you're kind of deflecting and not putting a whole lot of energy towards it, which is honestly what I would do. I think it sounds like you've got good instincts on it.
All right, thanks.
And some kids mask eating disorders under the name of being vegan or vegetarian. Absolutely, and honestly, it's a hall pass. And unless your family has historically been vegan or vegetarian, it's a hard pass for me. It's a no. For a developing kiddo, they need the animal fats, they need the animal proteins. It's a hall pass, and they're using it as a guise to be restrictive in nature. I'm sorry I come in hot on that. It's one of the biggest things that we have. Like, we'll see kids start to pull back from what is identified as unhealthy, which is oftentimes red meat or pork, and then they'll pull back from cheeses and dairies, or they'll be lactose intolerant. It's like last summer you really liked ice cream, so I don't believe you, you know. So yeah, vegan and vegetarianism I have a strong response to, because more often than not that is where an eating disorder is starting, and because these kids are smart, they know how to play it under the socially acceptable norm. And so just being really, really mindful of that. If a child is rushing and not eating enough to get to fun activities, that's normal for a tween. I would say just being kind of aware of changes in mood and affect on that one. If you notice that, like, when they are at a meal, they're seeming really anxious and distracted and not themselves, or then they're not engaging with peers or something like that, I would look more at the bigger picture on that. But yeah, honestly, some kids are just not big eaters until they are. And so I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in rushing out to do other fun things as long as they're eating at other intervals. So like if they're, you know, missing afternoon snack, but they're eating a decent supper, then you're probably okay.
And just to kind of follow up with that, for a kid who, you know, says, well, I'm just not hungry in the morning, or I'm, you know, you know, where's the line between forcing them, like, no, you need to eat a meal, versus, okay, listen to your body if you're not hungry?
I would say look at like what their norms have been, because like I am a professional eater. I mean, honestly, that's part of my job. It's what I do. I'm not a breakfast eater. I've never been a breakfast eater. And so when somebody says to me, I just don't like breakfast, I'm like, okay, if you are struggling with an eating disorder, we're going to have to change that. But also it's like if you're noticing something that is a new manifestation, so this kid used to house, you know, the lumberjacks breakfast at IHOP every Saturday morning, and is now like, I'll have a glass of water. Then you're looking at behavioral changes more than anything, and again, looking at more themes than data points. So you want to look at, what did they eat lunch? Are they eating supper? Like, are there other telltale signs that their relationship with food might be distorted? And so I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater of like, if somebody's like, this is just not what I enjoy, or I'm not really big on that, then there can be grains of truth in that. And also it's like, just keep an eye out for other situational factors or other indicators that something bigger might be going on, as opposed to, I'm just not a breakfast person.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Something that I was thinking about with especially the elementary age group, we hear a lot of parents say, well, my kid is just picky and all they ever want to eat is mac and cheese. And I know you talked briefly about RFID, like where is that line, and how can parents tell when it's a phase, or, you know, just a picky kid, versus that there's a really big problem?
I would say the anxiety present. So if you have a kiddo who's really struggling with RFID, then you can present them with mac and cheese and chicken nuggets as their normal, and then carrots, and the carrots are going to cause a complete and utter meltdown, and anxiety and distress, more so than just like, I don't like that, I'm not eating it. It's like, I can't eat that, is more the energy, and they're not going to have the words to articulate that. It's going to sound like, I don't like that, but the energy is going to be different, and you're going to know your kid of like, is this a normal amount of distress? Like, are these carrots really, you know, this stressful for this kiddo, or is it just like, you don't want to eat them and you're not having it and this is a phase? And so again, it's looking at kind of the energy behind it, not just the answer behind it.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Would it be okay if I passed along either your email address or this presentation, or
Any and all of the above? Yeah, I'm a pretty
okay.
open community resource. I've had a lot of parents in the community call and go, I don't know what my kids need, and I'm always happy to field those, so that's completely fine.
Do you make like, let's say somebody felt like that their child maybe didn't have an eating disorder, but maybe had some disordered eatings? Are you able to make referrals for therapists and people and dietitians?
Absolutely, and I know a lot of really good therapists that aren't necessarily eating disorder therapists too. So if their kid's struggling with anxiety associated with COVID, I think we're seeing a pretty rampant amount of that. So we have the fortune of being in a pretty professionally dense area, which is nice, because you can kind of turn around and find the person that's right for you know, your family, your fit, and all of that stuff. So yeah, that's absolutely something we can do.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. This will be, hold on.